Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 7th of June. Today we're looking at important developments, starting off with the Velyka Novosilka sector, then going to the Vovchansk riverfront, and then working our way to Chasiv Yar itself, and then finishing off with the Vovchansk and Lipysti axes. And really today's video is characterized by the Russian forces in several sectors that I have really not talked about a lot, simply because of their static or positional nature in terms of the fighting there. Some of those areas have seen very minor activations, and I would say that's because the Russian forces are taking advantage of the culmination of really months or perhaps a year of just firing relentlessly towards those positions, and the fact that in some cases troops are redirected to key parts of the front line, such as around Avdiivka, Bakhmut, etc., etc. And some of those forces were redirected to those particular sectors because the elite units that were holding the line over there had to be moved further northward to defend on the Kharkiv border, first to stabilize the line, and now to perhaps conduct localized counterattacks, as we're going to get into. And so the Russian forces did have a window of opportunity to take advantage of the dynamics on the ground and some of the elevation to conduct minor advances. In any case, let's look at the situation around Ocheretyne and Staromayorsk. Still, the Russians have not fully solidified control over the ruins of Staromayorsk, but what we are seeing at the very least is a consolidation of the fields in between Ocheretyne and said village. And so we have a video here which is from June 6th. It shows two Russian vehicles as they're advancing towards the bridge which connects the two sides of the Ocheretyne River. And so this is the axis of the Russian advance, and they were trying to displace Ukrainian forces which were at the time positioned around that bridge and around some of the hedgerows that are set up in this particular position over here. And so now the Russian forces do have more control in this region, with the Ukrainian forces withdrawing into the residential areas of Ocheretyne itself. Further westwards, we have a video that was released from the 58th Motorized Brigade, a Ukrainian unit that is now split up in its duties, because not only does it have to repel the assaults on Ocheretyne, which so far it has been able to contain the Russian activity to the southern section of the village, but it also has to repel now Russian forays into the fields west of Novodonetske, which is a very important area for the Ukrainians to try to keep a lid on because of the topography in the region. And so we have here this video. It shows how they shelled a Russian vehicle in particular. I believe it was destroyed, and then you had infantry dismounting out of the vehicle as it was located along a tree line. And those soldiers as well, they were also shelled by the 58th Brigade. And so in that case, they were able to prevent any sort of further Russian advance directly to the west of Novodonetske. But there was an advance, which you can see over here. It amounts to around 5 square kilometers in terms of the extent of the advance. And then we look at the actual distance. It's around 1.6 kilometers northwards. And so this is important as the Russian forces were able to advance through the gray zone. And this region that I'm marking in red over here, it is just generally a higher elevated area on a hill. This hill also overlooks the Ocheretyne River to the west, where you have Ocheretyne, and then further northwards various other Ukrainian villages that were retaken during the counteroffensive now over a year ago since it started. And then also it overlooks various Ukrainian frontline positions in these tree lines or fields located on the floodplain that essentially runs to the north of Novodonetske, which the Russians currently have control over. And so, yes, the 58th, they want to prevent the Russians from getting control over additional ridges that overlook their positions, and also the supply lines running along some of these paved roads over here towards the line of contact. Now, moving on to the Pokrovsk front, there's been a lot of commotion recently about engagements specifically east of Sokil. So really, over the past few weeks, the Russian forces have ramped up efforts at entering Sokil. And as you can see on the map, of course, it could be done through open fields, but there is one reliable paved road that could be utilized, and the Russians have been trying to assault through there using MTLBs, tanks, BTRs, etc. And so far, they had been unsuccessful in actually breaching and entering into Sokil up until an incident that occurred today, which we will get into. But the point of what I'm referring to with Sokil is the fact that the Ukrainians, they sent in their 47th Mechanized Brigade, a unit which was also involved in stabilizing the front line west of Avdiivka back in March, when the Russian forces had been able to reach the Durna River over here. The 47th was moved to the Perdici area, and for a period of about a month, they were able to first conduct localized counterattacks and then just stay on the defensive and protract the fighting for as long as possible, utilizing the Bradleys and, of course, their autocannons to fire towards any sort of advancing Russian force, and then to quickly dismount infantry in whatever places needed with their mobility. And so that was generally the idea. And then you also had Abrams that were engaged in this region. And the entire point was just to protract the fighting while lines that are several kilometers westwards could be built up and just repeat that entire cycle. And so now the 47th is doing the same exact thing, but just in the area around Sokil, which is also located on a floodplain, which is just an extension of the Vovcha River, as you can see over here, just as essentially like a tributary of the Vovcha River. And so the 47th was tasked with essentially holding the line, preventing the Russians from getting control of the nearby fortifications. And mostly this is being done utilizing Bradleys. Abrams were withdrawn from the fighting around late April, and since then they've been reintroduced. We've seen a lot of them starting in late May, but their usage in these sort of engagements with Russian BMPs and with sort of more mobile assets is limited in a sense. And there have been some complaints from Ukrainian crewmen from this particular brigade about issues surrounding the Abrams. Of course, there are issues with every single system, but specifically regarding the way that it's not adaptable for this particular sort of warfare. There's various issues, including, for instance, the issues with condensation within the internal parts of the Abrams, which cause issues with the various electric nodes, for instance, the communication systems, which could get fried, or any sort of power outlets, they could get damaged very quickly. And so that's also reducing the amount of Abrams that actually could be utilized on the front line. Not mentioning the fact that there are many Abrams that have been targeted by FPV drones. It's not to say that they've been destroyed, but they've definitely been targeted by them. At this point, Russian sources are claiming that it's up to 14 that have been hit. And of course, they use the language of destroyed, but you can't really use that in some of these videos because a lot of the videos are inconclusive, like this one over here. Of course, you could see that it's generally flying in the direction of the Abrams, but in terms of the FPV doing enough to actually destroy it, especially after April, they've been given additional explosive reactive armor. So it is hard to tell if it actually destroyed it or just damaged it and it's being repaired. But yeah, 14 videos of separate Abrams tanks have been shown of the Russians, at the very least, trying to hit them. And so that is something to keep in mind, given the fact there are 31 of them. And so, just getting back to the Sokil points, the Ukrainians, despite the Russians being able to send in a large amount of reserves from their various brigades that were holding here, they were able to maintain the front line for several weeks at basically the gates of Sokil, and now that's started to change. So the 47th Brigade, they claim that they were able to keep at bay 3 brigades in particular. They didn't mention which ones. But in terms of active Russian units here, we know the 15th is still active in this region. A lot of other units that engaged in the fighting in March and helped with those initial advances, they may not be here anymore. They may have been rotated because the Russians do have a strategic reserve in this region, which is pretty substantial actually when you look at it in terms of sizes of divisions that are not even being committed and full tank regiments that are not fighting at the front line right now. You have 38th Motor Rifle Brigade in development taking Ocheretyne, and then you have just various other units that are located generally in this region, and I don't have specific information about whether they were pulled out. I have to do a deep dive into that in a separate occasion. And you have just various territorial defense units, DPR units that are generally stationed here. So it is possible that the 47th is being accurate in that claim, but the 47th is not alone here. There are also Ukrainian units that have been sent to generally defend this sector, although 47th has been relied on heavily. There are some other ones like 25th Airborne Brigade that are defending in this region, and so it's not fair to say that it's just one unit doing all the work. In any case, what I want to talk about is an incident where you had this one Russian BTR-82, and it was, of course, mounted with a cope cage, and there was an infantry squad mounted on top of the BTR, and so that's probably just in order to get out quickly and in order to fit in more soldiers on a singular vehicle. And they advanced along this particular paved road. This is after weeks of the Russian forces just gradually, meter by meter, trying to take over every single field and tree line here, which they were able to do until they reached the outskirts. And then you have the BTR sent in today. they were able to make their way through and actually enter through the eastern side into Sokil. And then here we have this really cool footage. It's the location where the BTR-82A passed the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle that was firing towards it. And so there was, of course, an exchange of fire between the 25 millimeter autocannon, and then you had the gun from the 30 millimeter from the BTR. So they fired towards each other. The Bradley was able to, I believe, kill at least one Russian soldier that was sitting on top of the BTR, and then there may have been others that fell off and then just ran along with the BTR after falling off from the top, and they may have survived at the end. And then, of course, you had the Bradley, the BTR firing towards the Bradley. And as we got to the end of the video, because there was a video that was released initially by the 47th Brigade, we could see at this specific geolocation that the BTR-82 was in the process and the verge of coming to a standstill. We don't actually see it stopping, but it was coming to a standstill after presumably taking hits by the 25 millimeter autocannon. And this was done after it breached Sokil, which was the entire goal of the vehicle being sent through this road, and doing so alone, of course, and doing so, first of all, with this peripheral vision being restricted, because the cope cage does restrict the range of vision that the driver of the BTR has, because the sides are harder to see just because of the physical obstacle of the cope cage. And then also just keeping in mind the BTR-82 does have some rather thin armor, and so it is impressive that it was able to make it all the way to this point. And although it definitely did sustain some sort of damage, so I don't know if it was destroyed, but it does look like the Russian soldiers within it, they dismounted and they sort of connected with the other Russian soldiers that survived falling off, and they sort of organized at this point in the center of Sokil. And so we don't have any proof that those Russian groupings located in the center of the village were pushed back. There simply isn't any yet. So I'm just keeping this entire region, this, I guess, 1 or 2 kilometer region, a gray zone for now before we get full confirmation. But then the Russian side, they released their version of events where they they showed additional footage, which gives us the idea that the Bradley itself was destroyed. It was at the very least damaged and then had to be forced to be abandoned by the crew. Russian sources claimed that it was damaged by a mine and that it was then finished off by artillerymen, probably from the 15th Brigade, and that the 3 Ukrainian crewmen that were located inside, they were able to get out and retreated along the same road going in this direction westwards towards Sokil itself. And so it's pretty weird, because then you have the Ukrainians retreating to the same positions where the Russian soldiers, the assault troops, were able to dismount. And so I don't know what sort of firefight engagement occurred at the time. This was several hours ago. And so it is a bit of a fog of war right now, whether the Russians are still present over here, whether the Ukrainians were able to send in additional Bradleys and counterattack. But we do know that at the very least the BTR was able to achieve its goal of dismounting within Sokil, and that troops were present there at the time. So really do keep an eye out for what this can mean for the undermining of Ukraine's defenses here, because you can see now how the flanks of this trench over here are compromised, not to mention the fact that Ocheretyne is under Russian control, and the fields south of it that are all located on hills overlook the floodplain on which Sokil is located. And same thing goes for these hills located on the rail line, also overlooking Ukrainian positions leading into and within Sokil. Additionally, we have a minor update north of Ocheretyne. So we have a video here from the 110th Mechanized Brigade. Yes, they're still active. And their FPVs, they caused a cook-off to a Russian tank in, north of Ocheretyne. And so that just gives us a confirmation of the unit existing here and the Russian presence in that region. And of course, on June 5th, we actually had an update from Deep State, which indicated that there was further Russian control several hundred meters north of the previous front line where it was imagined to be. So the Russian forces were able to get control over additional fields in the area in between Arkhangelsk and Novosilka. This is really important because the area where the Russians have continued advancing, despite stalling in several other sectors, is along this one vector northwards, and this is the particular vector which is located on a hill. This hill just extends basically in this direction that I'm showing over here, and overlooks the trenches and the positions in the village where the Ukrainians have currently coalesced and are trying to hold on to in Kalinove. And so that's definitely the Russian rationale behind continuing to advance here, with the broader term goal of eventually displacing the Ukrainian garrison over here from the west. Okay, so now I have some very interesting changes on the Chasiv Yar front. Let's start south to north, basically. So here's the geolocation from June 6th. It shows a 500-meter Russian advance along the Donbass Canal. And we know this based on the video that was released by the Black Swan drone unit. It's a unit that's become very prominent in the Chasiv Yar area, mainly from their FPV and drone drops on advancing Russian soldiers and vehicles. And so they targeted the Russian axis of advance. And this is very interesting, and it's reminiscent to me of what happened in Avdiivka when the Russians were able to use the underground tunnel in order to basically flank Ukrainian positions, get into the rear, and then utilize that momentum to advance through the southern outskirts of the city. So this is a bit different, but you could still see the general plan of the Russians, where they essentially they had control of fields that are just to the west of Ivanivske. In this area over here, they got control over some forested areas, and then from there they were able to send a small number of infantry squads into the Donbass Canal region. And the Donbass Canal, it has a specific area which spans, I think, a kilometer that is on land, and there are two pipelines that are connecting the two bodies of water of the canal that are located further northwards. And so this area, it has a ditch and a pipeline on top of the ditch, and so the Russian forces have either used the ditch itself or have actually entered into the pipeline as sort of cover as they continue to advance northwards and try to secure additional positions. And the Ukrainians, they are aware of this, and the Black Swan unit, they spotted a group of several Russian soldiers doing this exact thing at this particular location, and so they dropped grenades into the openings in the pipeline in order to try to, of course, kill those Russian soldiers. I don't know the status of those soldiers, but definitely there was shelling using the grenades of the pipeline area, and they also claim that they've used mortars to try to target those Russian soldiers. And so now we know the extent of the Russian advance as they continue to solidify control over this local nature reserve that is just south of the Canal district. And this nature reserve is very important because getting full control over it would give the Russian forces a sort of concealment and not really cover, but it does definitely give you concealments from Ukrainian artillery and would allow them to move in, especially just ground soldiers, towards the land crossing of the Donbass Canal, and then reach this other body of forested area south of Chasiv Yar itself, and of course helps with the flanking of the Canal district. As we're going to get into, that's very important right now because the Russian forces have been verified based on a video from June 7th to have advanced within the northeastern portion of this district. And so this video came from the 41st Mechanized Brigade. Their FPVs hit various Russian vehicles in the area just east of the Canal district, which is basically near these trenches over here. I was able to identify that it was generally along this road over here based on the trenches that are nearby. And so they were able to hit several Russian tanks and vehicles. And then they also hit the forward positions of the Russians, which included positions in these garages over here that you see. The Russian forces were able to advance through those garages and are now present within parts of the factories, the northeastern factories of the district, where there's currently clashes going on. And so you see an advance of the Russian forces from the dachas into some of the more urban parts of the district. If we look at the extent of the advance, it's likely around 100 to 200 meters southwest. Then going further north, Kalinina, we now have clarification on this front, which I talked about previously about some of the ambiguity surrounding a video. I think it's from May 31st or June 1st, I don't remember, of a Russian MTLB crossing past the Donbass Canal and dismounting infantry within areas that are supposed to be Ukrainian fortified with trenches. And definitely the Russians were able to do that for a certain period of time. But based off of new footage that has been surfaced from June 4th onwards, we can see that likely the Ukrainians were able to either repel that attack or the Russians on their own volition withdrew after probing the area, because we do have still a confirmed Ukrainian presence within Kalinina, although it is severely undermined due to these Russian forays. So just to look at some of the footage that's basically used as proof to show that Ukrainians are still in Kalinina. Video from June 6th from the 200th Motor Rifle Brigade. This is an Arctic unit, and they were very active around Orikovo-Vasilivka to the north, but they're also operating here in Kalinina. And so they do have a large artillery component, which really just releasing compilation of just shelling of Ukrainian soldiers in the ruins here, especially in the western portion near the canal, but also near the line of contact where you see the blue line in the open fields here. Here's another video, which is from the 200th Brigade as well, showing the compilation from June 3rd of shelling of houses here. And so you get the idea, a lot of these houses, they were previously not as affected by the war, but now you just see a significant increase in the amount of ruins. Looking here, this is a confirmation that at the very least the Russians were able to advance and get positions within the outskirts of Kalinina. and this would be a confirmation of a 300-meter advance along the paved road into Kalina. And this is from a compilation from Igor Drone Group, where they dropped explosives onto Russian infantry in the locality. And of course, if we look at the vector of the Russian advance, it is from 2 roads in Novodonetske. And this is something that I forgot to mention in earlier updates. But a big reason why the Russians were even able to end up getting a presence around Kalina is because of advances that are located to the northeast of the village. And I was not aware of these advances because I just didn't see the footage, but now I have. And this is footage from the 56th Motorized Brigade, specifically the 21st Sarmat Battalion, which is located here. It's detached from the rest of the brigade, which is located further to the southwest around the Vovchansk River. But this battalion, they released footage of FPV strikes on Russian infantry in these forward trenches. And so the Russians are actually in control of a rather large area that is to the west of Novodonetske, which includes fortified regions and is also on rather high elevation, basically on parity with Kalina and also on parity with the ridge on which the Donbass Canal is located. And it overlooks Sriharivka, and so that's also just a local advantage for the Russian garrison over here in the Novodonetske area. And the fact that they were able to get control over these trenches, these fields, this forested region, did help secure the flank of the roads on which the Russians advanced through in Novodonetske, which is on the valley, in order to help with their Kalina operations. Now, looking further north at the Siversk salient, we do have some minor updates. Here is a video that is from June 3rd. It shows the Ukrainians destroying a Russian MTLB after it got stuck in a trench just south of the village of Novosilka. This is a 300-meter advance, and just again a confirmation of Russians activating a new part of the front line, albeit without success in actually entering into Novosilka, because you do have components of a very strong Ukrainian brigade, the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade, holding positions in this area. But in terms of geography, I'm not going to get into a lot of it, but there is just a ridge, slight hill over here, just overlooking the Novosilka Valley, because Novosilka itself is located on the Bakhmutovka river plain, which is on just very low elevation. So the fact that it's still under Ukrainian control after all this time really is a testament to the defensive abilities of the 10th Brigade. Going further north, here we look at this geolocation from June 7th, and I know that's a long title, but what happened here is that you had 2 Russian soldiers on one motorbike, which is something that we're seeing a lot now, Russians using the motorbikes because of their mobility, cheapness. In some cases, they're actually installing the cope cages on top of the motorbikes and then putting a tarp on them, which I don't know how effective that is. I've seen the Ukrainian drone target one of them already. And here what we see is that they hit inside of a abandoned Russian MTLB to avoid the drones that were active in the region. And this is just east of Kupyansk. And so then you had the K2 drone group, which is a part of the 54th Mechanized Brigade. I think it's mechanized, not motorized. And they dropped an anti-tank mine onto the MTLB where the 2 Russian soldiers were hiding. And at least one of them caught on fire in the incident. And then what happens is, based on the footage, you could see that there are 4 abandoned Russian MTLBs and then 1 Desert Cross, because the Russians are also now using in a lot of these localized advances Desert Crosses, again, for the same reason that they're using motorbikes. And so that's just a slight confirmation of a Russian advance in the region, while Verkhnokamianske is still held by the Ukrainians despite being located on a rather low elevation. If we go further north, we'll look at the situation around Kupyansk. There is a slight changed situation here. Actually, first I'll do Ivanivka. So here we have a video which shows a Russian BMP that was destroyed by a mine just to the northwest of Ivanivka. Let's look at the distance from the actual village. It's about 1 kilometer to the northwest, and then we have a video here which shows a Ukrainian hexacopter. It dropped a PTM-1 anti-vehicle mine, and a separate Russian BMP ran over it, and as a result was damaged and abandoned. And then you have the Russian crew that was located within the BMP retreat eastwards back towards Ivanivka. I suppose the goal of the Russian foray in this region was to dismount and get control over the tree line in the immediate vicinity of Stepovo Novosilka. So now we have a confirmation that Ivanivka is under full Russian control, and it's already being utilized as a linchpin, a forward operating base to get control over the last village on the road to Petropavlivka and the Kupyansk outskirts, I guess barring Pischane, located over here. Additionally, south of Vilshana, we have a geolocated video from June 5th. It shows a Russian BMP that dismounted in a trench that was previously occupied by the Ukrainians. I guess you could say in some of these areas east of Sinkivka. and the Russian infantry squad, I think, consisted of 5 men. They were able to enter and clear out that defensive node. And so now you're looking at the next Ukrainian line in the region that is built around the local ditches. It would be around here. And again, this is part of the gradual activation in this region. But you do have, in terms of distance from populated areas, a distance of about 4 kilometers. And then from the next significant ridge, the Russians are currently about 600 meters away and then 2 kilometers away. Or my bad, I meant to say that most recent ditches, not ridges, because those ditches are utilized as defensive fortifications. Now looking at Vovchansk, we have a slight update. Here's a video. I'm clicking on it here. It's a video from the 501st Marine Battalion. I don't know why I said brigade here. It's battalion. But it shows this FPV hitting a lone Russian soldier located in the entrance to Vovchansk. The point is in the video itself, it's the fact that now we have confirmation that the entirety of the 36th Brigade has been moved to Vovchansk, which would show you guys that the Ukrainians are really have a very low priority for what's going on around Kherson, to the extent they would be able to, they see fit that entire brigade has to be moved away from that sector. And who knows, this could just be the beginning. There may be other brigades from the Kherson region that could be moved over here to assist in these counterattacks. But now we know that at least one of them was, and it shows that there is a deprioritization of the Krinky area, which is something that, for instance, Ukrainian channels have talked about for a while. It doesn't mean that they've completely withdrawn, but it does mean that they've scaled down their operations there. And now we know that this unit in particular is active around here. And as a broader consequence of reinforcements being pulled in, especially from the National Guard, some air assault units, we also saw, as I talked about in my last video, this unit over here, the 101st Brigade for the protection of General Staff that fought around Kiev. They were also moved in to help assist on the western flank of Vovchansk. So all these units played a role in this. And now the Ukrainians definitely do have a manpower advantage. In terms of the quantity, I can't give you a specific number because I have to look in detail into that and count how many brigades are really active. But definitely the Ukrainians do have an advantage here, which is something that especially is important during defensive operations and then for conducting localized counterattacks, which is what we're seeing to a certain extent, because new geolocated footage which came out from the Russian side, from the Akhmat side, shows shelling of downtown northern Vovchansk and areas that were previously under Russian control that are near this vertical highway and I guess near the local school and the facilities over here, the factories. And so, for instance, some of these buildings here have been reoccupied by Ukrainian infantry squads, and the Akhmat forces are, of course, responding with their shelling compilation, which should give us verification of such a Ukrainian advance. And then we look further westwards at the Lipysti axis. There's something similar going on in terms of the extent of Ukrainian localized counterattack. So we have this video here from the Russian side, I believe. They filmed this. It's from June 7th. It shows a Ukrainian infantry fighting vehicle firing towards Ukrainian or Russian positions, in the trenches and within the village of Velyka itself. So the Ukrainian vehicle is not actually in the village, but they're just on the western approaches. And so definitely that means the western flank is secured for the Ukrainians, which is important. And then we have to look at the implications for the situation just south of Velyka, whether the Ukrainians also try to put pressure and advance through the fields over there in order to secure the village. And I guess the rationale would be to try to get control over that area because it serves as a forward operating base for the Russian forces in order to get control of the hills that are located just to the northeast of Lipysti. Because Velyka itself is the closest village to the Lipysti axis, and then the next closest one is Morhovets, which is nearly 3 kilometers to the northeast. And so definitely there is a local significance for the village, and that would be part of why the Ukrainians are trying to organize a localized counterattack over here. So far the Russians are holding though, and so just keep that in mind as the battle unfolds. And one last thing I want to mention before the video ends is that the Ukrainians are in the process now and have already formed 4 Ranger regiments, which are parts of their new Special Ranger Corps, which is going to be a part of Ukraine's Special Operation Services. And so since the summer counteroffensive, we've seen the creation of 14 new brigades on paper, 9 of them being infantry brigades. and most of them not really seeing any sort of combat in the year since, just because they're still in the process of formation, getting enough men, getting enough equipment, training, whatever it may be. And so now the creation of these ranger regiments, it's more so supposed to be a smaller localized units. I really don't know if it's actually the size of a what would be considered a standard regiment, because it is a part of a special operations force. And so it's probably smaller, and also in terms of the composition, it includes, for instance, a UAV company, an anti-air company, a sapper company, artillery company. And so again, when you have 4 companies at the very least, when you add that up, it could be at least dozens, maybe 100 plus, and then you add up that times 4 because there's 4 of them, and so it could be in the hundreds range just as initial estimates. And they're also still in the process of recruitment, and so in terms of manpower, it's not really supposed to be a sort of silver bullet to increase manpower anyway, but it's more so supposed to be an expansion of Ukraine's specialized units. For instance, its model is based off of, for instance, the Kraken regiment, which is the Ukrainians are really trying to model a lot of their modern units off of that for some reconnaissance, sabotage operations. And so that's mainly going to be the focus of these Ranger regiments. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.